Good stormy evening, everybody. As you can see, it's raining quite hard behind me. I've got another Bigfoot encounter that was sent to the channel. We've got a couple more of these to get through in the next few weeks. I just haven't had a lot of time, but it is time. This is a really good one, so here we go. Dear Bigfooter Gary, I have an encounter I would like to share with your channel. My sister is helping me get this typed up for you and presentable, as my computer skills are not the greatest. This is fitting, as my sister was with me for this experience and we both have information we can add to the account. We live in southern Louisiana and spend much of the year deep in the bayou. We won't say the exact area, as everyone knows everyone around here in our small community, and there is a lot of superstitions in Cajun culture. Around here, rumors can take on lives of their own. Out in the bayou, we have two old family camps. One camp is from our mother's family and the other is from our father's side. We have had weird instances happen at both places and know that the swamp is full of energy and strangeness. Folks around here don't go out in the swamp at night unless they are very brave or in severe need of food or other resources. Many are those who make their living off of the land through crabbing, shrimping, trapping, hunting, and fishing. These are things done not just as enjoyable hobbies, but down here are a way of life and bring income to the family. Our parents are getting on in age, and most of the camp maintenance and upkeep falls on myself and my sister. You can call us Charlie and Laura. We use the family camps as getaways and hunting lodges. We do have a big family, and more than one member has heard strange calls and screams from the swamp at night. My family calls this screamer the Ta-taille. The Ta-taille is recorded in Cajun history as an eater of children, a beast of the swamp. Flesh and blood, it can howl, scream, bark, and we even think imitate other late-night swamp critters. Is there more than one? Of course there is. My father and grandfather before him had many tales of the scary things that lurk out in the swamp waiting to ambush folks if they wander into territory they have no right being in. Our family does believe the Ta-taille to be a flesh and blood beast. We have found tracks over the years and other signs of its presence in the form of nests and forest litter, such as sticks, logs, and rocks that have been placed as warning signs to keep out. The South is blessed with many legends of other creatures that call the swamps home. Not all of these are flesh and blood. As children, our grandmother would keep us in line by telling us gruesome tales of Madame Grand Doigt. English translation, Mrs. Longfingers, a swamp witch who would eat the toes of children who had been bad. On the ends of her extremely long fingers were even longer fingernails, which she could use to pick door locks and then ensnare the bad children as they were sleeping. Some would say these are creatures of myth, but around these parts, superstitions are very deeply ingrained in culture and everyday living. Cajuns are a people steeped in superstitions. The older generations only slightly more so than the newer. Everyday things such as the flame or spark of a candle can dictate things that may come to pass. To see the moon in various locations throughout the night sky or in specific phase can also be a good or bad luck. Many are the things that one must watch for and practice for good luck and health. In our culture, it is expected that you will always touch the dead when presented with an opportunity, if you do not wish to be haunted by ghosts. And if you are haunted by a ghost, the only resolution is one which my family knows well. My great-grandmother always used to tell us about the haunting at the camp on my father's side of the family. For years the land was dark and terrorized by a ghost. Nowadays modern folk would call this creature a shadow man. Back in the early 1930s it was simply called a ghost. Everyone knew back in those days that to rid yourself or your property of such an attachment, you had to take a silver dollar, melt down the coin into a bullet, and shoot the ghost. And that is exactly what my great-grandfather had to do. This is another tale in and of itself. Apparently, it was a great battle of wills, and my grandfather made his silver bullets and did indeed rid the cabin of this dark entity. To this day, we have no problems on that land. Okay, now that you have a feel for our culture, the myth and true belief we have in these things, we want to share our encounter with the Ta-taille. As I say, we have had many experiences with screaming from the swamp and in the late hours of the night. Quite often we hear tree limbs being torn off of trees and being thrown or smashed as well. The specific account, the only one in which we actually saw the beast, and it is every bit as terrifying as we had imagined after all of those years of listening to it. The stories we had heard did not do the actual encounter of this beast justice. To live through such an experience, to see the Ta-taille up close, to smell it, and then almost wet yourself in terror, knowing that you are going to die, is something no story can portray to the full extent or horror we experienced. Laura and I, as we mentioned, are the caretakers of both the family properties. Down here in the back swamps, we do have quite a problem with feral hogs. It had been more of a problem at the one cabin than the other, and in the fall of 2016, Laura and I decided we would stay at the cabin for a week doing some minor property fixes and maintenance. I would take that week to shoot as many hogs as I could, and Laura was keen to get her fall turkey hunt on. And before anyone complains, we do not waste one bit of meat. We often use a barter system down here with neighbors and family, and I would have no problem offloading a dozen or more hogs. Our cabin is situated on a large piece of property in a remote section of swamp, and the easiest way to get in there and bring out a large supply of meat is by airboat. Laura and I packed all of the hunting supplies, some tools, and all of the other necessary goods for a week of living in the deep swamp. We have a fully loaded cabin with lots of supplies, and usually the goods you bring in are not the ones you end up using. Anyone familiar with a pantry system knows you use up whatever is next to expire. The cabin has solar and propane, so really it's not a bad way to spend a week off-grid. 1 hour in the truck and then another hour by airboat and you're at the property. We usually end up at one cabin or the other every couple of weeks. We have other brothers and sisters and they sometimes use the cabins as well, but not as often as Laura and I. This cabin was the one passed down the family line on my mother's side. The property is accessible by water only. Many decades ago there were old logging roads on the property, but many have been covered by water and swamp. Our closest neighbors are at least 20 minutes away by airboat, and that would be another old camp, long handed down through the family as well. Not always inhabited, the property is quite a bit more run down than ours. The grandkids do use it for hunting as well, but this particular week there was nobody home when we boated past. The first log cabin on this property was built in the late 1800s, believe it or not, and it stood until the 1930s. It was only used as the main house until about 1910. Newer cabins have been built over the years, and the one we now occupy was updated in the 1990s. We have cleared pasture on the property with old fence lines, and as I said earlier, old logging roads across the property here and there as well. I keep a side-by-side at the cabin and a small pirogue boat to fish some of the backwater on the property. We do have alligators, and I do hunt them to keep their numbers and size down. We arrived at the property late afternoon on the first day and were not unpacked and settled in until well after the dinner hour. Laura fried some fish we had caught on the way in, and we had biscuits and gravy. I remember this because that meal always reminded me of my grandfather. After dinner, Laura set about cleaning a while before she settled at the kitchen table to work on one of her puzzles. We don't have any TV or such at the cabin. We do have a radio, but in terms of entertainment, it's usually puzzles or knitting for Laura. As for me, I was going hunting. The best time to knock off hogs is at night. I used the side-by-side and spotlight. Back in 2013, I treated myself to a brand new Smith & Wesson M&P 10, a hard-hitting 308 chambered semi that is hands down the best hog killing gun I know of. I paired this gun with the Sightmark Wraith night vision scope. It works a treat on those destructive pigs. I have been known to get as many as 5 sows in a single night on this property. I can't take that many when hunting alone, as I am not a young man anymore, but I will work all night to get as many as I can. As I say, I don't just shoot them to get rid of them, we use every ounce of meat, so the workload is immense. That first night I packed up the side-by-side and left Laura at the cabin. I had about a 20-minute drive across the property to the old cattle fields. There I can see a couple hundred yards. The pigs love the old pasture and root around out there regular. The edge of the pasture drops down on either side where it gets a little swampy. The pigs use this edge line for wallowing. They are always in this pasture. It's a great spot because of the distance I can see. I rolled up on the pasture and shut the side-by-side off. It was full dark by the time I got there, and when I shut the machine off, the swamp was black. I have a really good spotlight and, as I say, night scope. I have a homemade beanbag that I rest and use on the front of the machine. Quite often I shoot leaning out the side or front without even getting out of the machine. I have not used a stand in years. This works and I'm fairly comfortable right there in the side-by-side. I could see the new moon through the top of the tree line as it started to rise. I knew my grandfather would have thought this to be ill luck. I pondered this as I sat there in the dark listening. I would get my gun out of the case eventually. I always liked to just sit and listen for the first little bit to see how many hogs were around. I heard nothing. The swamp was as still and quiet as I had ever heard. As I sat there in the dark, the hair on the back of my neck started to stand on end. I grew uneasy and reached down for my gun case. I removed the rifle and loaded it, turned on my scope, and immediately took a look out across the pasture. Nothing was moving. Wait, there was something moving. It wasn't on the ground though. It was bright. I could see a light weaving back and forth through the swamp and tree line way out past the end of the pasture. What was I looking at? I followed it with my scope and it never stopped moving. It was not big, maybe a couple of inches around. I looked up from my scope and tried to find the light with my eyes alone. I could see nothing. I tried again to find the light using the scope, but it was gone. I sat in the side by side for at least an hour, checking every 5 minutes or so to see if any hogs had come out on the pasture. I could not shake that feeling that I was not alone. I was being watched and it made me feel unnerved. I would have said that we had a trespasser if I didn't know better. But I do know better. Many times my wife, kids, sister, or myself have seen those strange lights out in the swamp, always off in the distance. They are always silent, always moving, and mysterious. We have never come up with a good answer as to what we are seeing. As I sat there contemplating this, I realized I was growing tired. I couldn't leave without getting at least one pig, so I forced myself to stay vigilant. It didn't work. I fell asleep. I don't know for how long, but I did start awake as I heard running hooves and hogs out in the pasture. I quickly brought up my gun and looked. There were at least a dozen pigs making their way across the open field. In seconds I had picked the one I wanted and squeezed off 2 rounds. I knew the shots were good. It was a large sow and she had jumped with each shot, confirmation that I was on target. I always find it amazing how quickly you can come to your senses when hunting. Survival instincts from the ancestors, I presume. I watched as the rest of the pigs cleared off. I didn't have a good shot at any of the others, so I didn't bother shooting. I knew I would get another chance soon enough. I waited 5 minutes or so for the sow to bleed out before I started the side-by-side and made my way out to the first kill. I made quick work of that pig. It was big and I quartered it to make it easier on myself to load into the machine. We have a drop gate on the back and I had hopes of getting at least a couple good sows that night. In my younger days, I would have halved that pig and loaded it. That makes for easier hanging back at the cabin, but the old bones prefer quartered meat. I had just loaded the last quarter into the machine when from behind me I heard the loudest wailing scream you can imagine. Almost a hog squeal mixed with a woman being delimbed. I froze in my tracks. Instant terror gripped me. That scream was unmistakable. The Ta-taille, and it was close. I was on the edge of the pasture and the thick swamp was less than 50 yards behind me. I reached for my gun and scope, but stopped when I realized my spotlight was right there on the drop gate. I actually just got a shiver reading that. Sorry, guys. I turned the light on as I spun towards the scream. The scream continued, but I saw nothing at first. And then I noticed much higher up than what I had been looking, a set of eyes shining. They had to be at least 10 feet off the ground. This thing was, as I say, just inside the tree line. I could make out a dark shape of body and those 2 glowing eyes. Green eyes, and about a foot apart. My heart literally stopped. In all the years out here in the swamp, we had heard this creature before, but never this close, and we had never seen it. This was more terrifying than anything I could have imagined. The size of this thing was bigger than I could have imagined. I made my way up to the side of my machine to the front seat where I had left my AR-10. I was going to have to shoot this thing. I only took my eyes off of it for a moment when I looked down to grab my gun, but when I looked back up, with gun in hand, it was no longer in the center of my spotlight. I was sure I had not moved the light. I began panning the light along the edge of the woods, panic setting in as I didn't know where it was. Was it trying to flank me? God forbid it was behind me. I spun and checked the woods behind. I couldn't find it. I shut the drop gate and jumped back in the side-by-side. I started the machine and floored it. I hadn't even finished cleaning up the site of the sow kill. I didn't care. I was getting out of there. I raced back to the cabin and Laura. She was still up knitting when I burst into the cabin. My eyes were as big as dollar coins. Right away she jumped up and nodded. She told me she thought she had heard the Ta-taille scream earlier in the evening and wondered if I had heard it. I told her not only had I heard it, but that I had seen it. I described it to her and began to shake all over again. Eventually I calmed down, and after a cold drink and 20 minutes, I felt brave enough to head out to the shed where I could hang the sow. I asked Laura to accompany me. I didn't even have to ask, she would have come anyway. As Laura and I were hanging the sow, we both stopped, as we once again heard that bitter scream of the Ta-taille. It was very distant, but unmistakable. I finished hanging the meat and went in to clean up. I was not feeling well. It was time for bed. That night, it took a long time to fall asleep, and when I did, I had the same dream over and over. I was being chased through the swamp by the Ta-taille, a giant, dark, and silent with green eyes and the long hands of the Madame Grand Doi. I know this last part was not what I had seen, but in my night terrors, the two legends had become one. Every time it would catch up to me, or I would fall, it would be there, standing over me, and it would lean in and scream that damn awful wail in my face, its teeth bared. I woke up numerous times, only to fall asleep again, each time, and be hunted down once again. The last time it screamed at me, I woke with Laura standing over me with a finger over her mouth. It took me a second to realize that I was awake, but still hearing that screaming, this time from outside the cabin. I jumped out of bed as Laura whispered, "I think it's after your sow." We moved to the kitchen window. It was still dark outside, but pre-dawn had arrived. I could make out the shapes of the outbuildings and something as it raced past the outhouse and towards my hanging shed. It was so fast I wasn't sure I had really seen something flesh and blood, something real. Laura gasped. Look at that," she whispered. "It's in the hanging shed." I grabbed the spotlight off the kitchen table and handed it to Laura. I told her to wait until I got my gun, which I then grabbed from beside the sink. I made my way to the back door and slowly opened it. I nodded to Laura to shine the light out the kitchen window and into the shed. I had my gun up by my eyes, but I was not looking through the scope. I was looking into the shed as I slowly stepped along the back porch. Laura turned the light on, and again my heart was in my throat. There, not 30 yards in front of us, was the Ta-taille, with its back to us, pulling down the sow from the rafters of the hanging shed. It was huge. I could clearly see the muscle definition on this thing, with long hair hanging off of its head, down its neck, and also down the back of its shoulders and forearms. As the spotlight hit the creature, it froze. Its arms were up, and it had been pulling on the wire holding one of the sow quarters. I'm not sure exactly what happened next. I just knew I had to shoot that thing for the safety of the camp. If great-grandfather had taught us anything with all of his stories, it was to stand up for yourself and your land. I started to bring the gun up, and I guess I shifted my weight as I did so. The boards of the porch under my feet let out a loud groan. The creature moved so fast I could hardly keep up with what happened next. It pulled its arms down to its side, taking the quarter sow right off the hanging wire, and within a second it turned and made to the right of the cabin. I had never seen anything move so quickly and smoothly. Laura tried to keep the light on it as it moved, and I finished bringing up the gun. All this took no more than a couple seconds. I brought my eye to the scope and fired instinctively. Once, twice, 3, 4, 5. Lead was flying, and I was pulling that trigger as fast as I could. The only problem was that in my excited state, I had forgotten to turn on the night vision scope. I was literally firing the gun with my other eye trained on the creature, and I wasn't even using the crosshairs because the scope was not on. I know this sounds ridiculous, but let me assure you, even a seasoned hunter in a panic state or one with buck fever will tell you, this can happen. The Ta-taille was gone in an instant. I leaned on the cabin wall, breathing hard. Laura came to the back door and told me to get back inside. I refused. I had her bring me some more ammunition. I had to sit down on the porch as my heart was beating so fast. I don't think the Ta-taille was hit, as it never made any indication that it had been wounded, and of course I believe I was shooting clear over its head. That may have been a good thing, as I don't know what a wounded creature of that size would do. As it was, I searched the yard for blood and never found a drop. We did find 17-inch footprints and a muddy handprint on the side of the hanging shed. I think we did scare it and give it something to think about, as to this day we have not heard it scream in our neck of the woods since that incident. I have since covered the property in trail cameras, but have yet to get any photos. I believe they are still out there and in the deep swamp. I just hope they think twice about coming right in on our cabin. I have no problems defending what's mine. Laura and I love your channel, and not only just the Bigfoot stuff, but all of it. The photography, the hunting videos, and the beautiful colors you get up there in the fall. We just wanted you to know you are right to trust your gut instincts and wanted to remind you to be careful. These creatures are real and are dangerous. You probably don't want to come across one unarmed. Stay safe. Love from Louisiana. Charlie and Laura.